Hey all, Alex from Music Hub here, and today we are going to take a look at a few biographies of the great early Romantic composer Ludwig van Beethoven. Ludwig van Beethoven, born mid-December of 1770 in Bonn, died the 26th of March, 1827 in Vienna. While he studied with Haydn and was considered a sort of spiritual successor to Mozart in the Viennese musical scene, Beethoven was quick to prove himself as a unique composer for the time. With his uniquely raw display of emotional turbulence in his writing, coupled with his willingness to push formal and harmonic structures beyond what most patrons or even the public were comfortable hearing, Beethoven helped establish what would become the Romantic era for musical composition. Pieces such as his Third and Ninth Symphonies pushed the genre of the symphony into the sprawling epic form that grew to define musical romanticism, but at the same time you have works such as his Piano Sonata No. 14 in C-sharp minor, which we know today as the Moonlight Sonata. The simplicity of this piece helped transform the piano into an instrument that amateurs could play, a huge sea change in Western music that had major ramifications for music publishing, obviously music composition, and eventually the recording industry. And I haven't even touched on Beethoven's personal life, which is filled with unrequited romantic flings, alcoholism, depression, and obviously his hearing loss. So there's a lot to dig into here in this man's life. Unsurprisingly, Beethoven is the subject of more biographies than any other composer, so this video will be missing several essential ones almost certainly. Apologies in advance for that. I read 4 books for this project all in all, trying to keep it chronological as best I could. There is one exception though, and that is the book that I expected I would like the least, and I did end up liking the least. I am talking about Edmund Morris's 2005 biography, Beethoven, the Universal Composer. Arthur Edmund Morris, born the 27th of May, 1940 in Nairobi, died the 24th of May, 2019 in Danbury, Connecticut. A South African-born writer who moved to the United States in 1968, Morris is sort of a complex figure in the world of biography. On the one hand, his 3-part series on Theodore Roosevelt is widely considered the definitive reading of the 26th U.S. president's life, winning Morris a Pulitzer Prize in the process. On the other hand, Morris's biography of Ronald Reagan, Dutch, generated a lot of controversy after Morris tried to use fictional characters as a framing device for Reagan's life, and his posthumously published biography of Thomas Edison flipped the traditional narrative structure around by telling the inventor's life in reverse chronological order, which also didn't sit well with a lot of people. So I was curious about how this Beethoven biography would go. As it turns out, Morris has a bit of a musical background. I think he studied it to some degree in college, so it's certainly not a bad or incompetent book. But it is mediocre, and it's hampered in part by being a pretty breezy 250-page overview of the composer's life. This is not Morris's fault. It was released as part of a series of short-form biographies from HarperCollins, but it constrains what Morris can do. Many pieces get glazed over in just a sentence, as Morris chooses to focus on the life of Beethoven at the expense of his music. And when he does try to write about the actual musical works, it can be a bit of a struggle, because even if Morris knows what he's talking about, I'm hardly convinced he's comfortable putting musical observations or analysis in writing. It's clunky, and frankly, it's done better on every other biography I'll be talking about, so I wouldn't waste your time with this one. Next up is the 2000 biography, released as part of Oxford University Press's Master Musician Series, Barry Cooper's Beethoven. Barry Cooper, born the 2nd of May, 1949 in Westcliff-on-Sea, Essex. A composer and musicologist who teaches at the University of Manchester, Cooper is most famous for his attempts at reconstructing lost Beethoven scores. Best known of these was his 1988 reconstruction of the first movement for what would have been Beethoven's 10th Symphony, which had previously existed only in scattered sketches and notations. There's about 250 measures worth, I believe, that exist from the last couple of years or so of Beethoven's life. It's far from a complete work, but it certainly shows an idea of where Beethoven might have taken his music if he hadn't died, and it definitely gives Cooper significant credibility as a potential Beethoven biographer. And indeed, Cooper's biography is credible. It does read as more of a scholarly biography than a popular one, which may turn some people off, and I wouldn't necessarily blame them. There's a lot of musical analysis that presumes some level of comfort with understanding these theoretical concepts rather than taking the time to explain them for the layperson. I also don't think Cooper takes enough time to contextualize Beethoven's life amongst the events of 18th and 19th century Europe, but as with the Morris book, I think this could be due to space constraints more than anything else. At not quite 450 pages, it's a little bit on the larger side to be sure, but when you're spending so much time doing the actual musical analysis in those pages, some things need to be cast to the side as a result. So I'm not sure if I really love how this biography was paced in general. But beyond that, the actual analysis is very interesting if you're already familiar with that sort of thing, and Cooper does see the importance of pairing Beethoven's musical development with the events that took place in his life. He even says in the introduction that he had to fight in order to use this structure. For context, most scholarly biographies discuss the composer's life in the first half of the book and then the music in the second half. Certainly, he comes off as a bit of a Beethoven fanboy at times, and I think he can be too lenient with Beethoven's antics and actions in some of these descriptions, but it's all done capably and credibly, like I said before. If you're not willing to read 700 plus pages of material on Beethoven, I don't think this Cooper biography is a half bad option at all. The next volume that I read is a 2009 Dutch language biography translated into English in 2020 by Brett Annabel, written by Jan Caeyers and entitled Beethoven, A Life. Jan Caeyers, born 1953 in Belgium. One of Europe's preeminent Beethoven experts, Caeyers studied musicology at the Katholieke Universiteit Leuven, where he continues to teach part-time to this day. Caeyers directed the Beethoven Academy Orchestra for a number of years, and in his other conducting roles, he's brought a focus on authentic Beethoven interpretations based off of his own personal research. As with Cooper, this makes him seemingly a very logical choice for a Beethoven chronicler. And, this book is amazing. I was honestly blown away by it. And it's not a light read. It comes in at just under 700 pages, but interestingly, it felt like the easiest book to make my way through out of all four of them. Caeyers is a fantastic writer, and with the assist from Annabel's translation, that the prose in the book finds that sweet balance of rich and descriptive traits that only a very small set of biographies can achieve, musician biographies or otherwise. Beethoven's influence is contextualized in its time exceptionally well here. There is actual focus on both Beethoven's personal life, which is dissected in an extremely fresh way that draws different conclusions from past Beethoven biographies, and just the events of the world at large. In that sense, it reminds me a bit of another famous conductor's biography of a composer, John Eliot Gardiner's Music in the Castle of Heaven, his biography of Bach. Since he was a conductor by trade, I guess I never would have pegged Gardiner as someone who could weave together so many cultural and biographical elements in a coherent narrative. That's something that a lot of trained writers would have difficulty in, but he passed that test with flying colors in his book, and so does Caeyers here. The musical analysis is obviously here too, and it is excellently done. I think Caeyers is good at simplifying these concepts for general consumption. But at the same time, perhaps the greatest strength of this book is its pacing. I never once felt like the analysis caused the book's momentum to crash to a halt. The music is discussed, the relevant parts highlighted and gone over, and then we move on. I think this is a case of when less equals more, and I appreciate Caeyers not assuming that he's writing for an audience of music connoisseurs. If you are someone who's looking for an in-depth theoretical discussion of Beethoven's greatest works, I don't know if this would be the first book I'd point you towards, but on almost every other level, this may be the best of the Beethoven biographies that I've read, and it's a high recommendation from me for anyone, regardless of musical background. That said, the last book that I read in this sequence was no slouch either. I'm talking about Jan Swafford's 2014 biography, Beethoven, Anguish, and Triumph. I discussed Jan Swafford in my video on Mozart biographies, where I argued that his book Mozart, The Reign of Love, while occasionally getting bogged down in middling writing and overly long musical analyses, was a really excellent look at Mozart's life, and I recommended it quite highly to all you guys. His Beethoven biography came a few years earlier, and it's an even longer read, running at just over 1,000 pages. A weighty tome indeed, but I'll be honest, I prefer it to the Mozart biography, as far as Swafford's books go, and although I don't prefer it to Caeyers' Beethoven biography, I think it does scratch some different itches that ultimately make it stand out in its own way. The main thing with this one is that Swafford gets lost in the musical analysis a lot, but I'm not bothered by it because in here, more so than in his Mozart biography, I can feel Swafford's admiration for Beethoven as a composer. The best way I can describe it is it's as though Swafford has compiled a PowerPoint presentation to defend this dissertation of why Beethoven was the greatest composer of all time. And as he's going kind of down the list explaining each point, he has this giant shit-eating grin on his face because he just can't get enough of this guy. It's a lot of fun to read, and again, Swafford is excellent at explaining these ideas in layperson's terms. But what I have to give Swafford a lot of credit for is that he is possibly the most critical of Beethoven himself out of all these authors. Beethoven was a troubled man, to put it lightly, and one who projected his own struggles and insecurities onto others, and yet the portrait of him that most biographers like to portray is a pretty romanticized one. Swafford, by contrast, isn't afraid to go for the jugular at times, especially when discussing Beethoven's nephew, Karl, and his sister-in-law, Joanna, who gets a very bad rap in most Beethoven narratives. The Kuber book especially is quite rough to her and borderline misogynistic at times. I appreciate this approach a lot, this ability to hold the worst qualities of Beethoven as a human together with Swafford's admirations of Beethoven's musical talents. And I think that sort of balance is something we all could learn from, accepting the positives with the negatives of these individuals. Certainly, the length of this book is intimidating, and there's a lot of space utilized for the Missa Solemnis and the Ninth Symphony specifically towards the end of the book, which is a bit extra compared to how much the other pieces are analyzed. I don't even think that the Third Symphony gets nearly that much space. But those are minor gripes in the grander scheme of things. This was a great book and very much worth your time, although I think I would still recommend the Caeyers volume more overall. And that's it, folks. I really hope you enjoyed this overview of the best, in theory, Beethoven biographies. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. More reviews are to come. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time right here on Music Hub.